Guten Abend. Es tut mir leid, ich kann diese Präsentation nicht auf Deutsch halten. So that's very sad because I learned, ich habe Deutsch für meine Abitur gemacht. But that was 25, 30 years ago. So, but I'm delighted to be able to be here to present Why Politics Fails, or as Joachim nicely pointed, Warum Politik so oft versagt, with its nice different German subtitle, Warum das besser wird, wenn wir unseren Egoismus überwinden. I fully agree with that subtitle. It's a different subtitle to the English one, so the Germans get something more about the importance of overcoming self-interest, and British people just get, here's a bunch of things you could do to save the world. So I'm going to talk to you in English, I'm afraid, about the book that just came out in Germany last year, in English a year beforehand. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I'm trying to achieve with the book. And then I'm going to do something that's not in the book. I'm going to talk about some of my own research that I've conducted, well, in part thanks to support from the European Research Council, so I survived Brexit. And I'll show you some of my data, show you some of the work I do as a social scientist to try and directly answer some of these really important questions. So you'll get the book, and then you'll get some things that are not in the book. And also, let me do some other terrible solipsistic advertising of myself. If you are interested in the themes of this book, in 2023, so not last year now, but not very long ago, I gave some lectures for the BBC called the Wreath Lectures. These are annual lectures. These were titled Our Democratic Future, and they were focused around the 5 main sections of Why Politics Fails. Now, Joachim mentioned what they are earlier. They are democracy, equality, solidarity, security, let me remember, and prosperity. But the BBC would only let me do 4 of those 5. And so equality was sacrificed, which is very ironic. But there are lectures about democracy given in London, a lecture about solidarity given in Sunderland in the northeast of England, a lecture about prosperity given in Atlanta, and a lecture about security that I gave in Berlin, where it was very interesting to talk to a German audience at that time in November of 2023 about the changes in German security and the policies of the government in terms of thinking about what remilitarization and so on would mean. So those are all available wherever you get your podcasts, as they say, on the BBC, but also on Spotify as well. And I've also been writing and talking about democracy in a couple of other venues. So you can see this nice big pink box here is What's Wrong with Democracy. That's a series that I did in the summer with Tortoise Media and Open Society Foundations, interviewing people about democracy. And then down the bottom is a radio show I do with Radio 4 called Rethink, where we do talk about all kinds of things, including artificial intelligence and public housing, but also about voting and about political parties and so on. So if you are not tired by the end of today's presentation with my voice, you can hear my voice in all kinds of other venues talking about these questions. But I'm going to talk about the book today. And as I said, I'm going to start by talking for maybe 30 minutes, 25 minutes about the book, about why politics fails, and these 5 traps that I identify, that Joachim mentioned earlier, in the book. These are these 5 big themes of the book: democracy, equality, solidarity, security, prosperity. What do I mean by these? What are the things that we want as a society that most people agree on? And then why is it so hard to get them? That's basically the theme of the book. And then I promised you some data, so there will be data. So if you like graphs, good news, you'll have to wait. But at the end, we'll talk about data, some surveys I've run, about 2 things I talk about in the book. The first I talk about quite a bit, which is how to tax wealth that people have, and why wealth taxation is so difficult, even though wealth inequality is much higher than it's been since the start of the 20th century. So that is a puzzle. Why is it so hard to tax wealth? And we'll want to look at some of the answers for that. And then I'm going to talk about another challenge. It's a real challenge in the United Kingdom, and the data I'll be doing will be mostly from Britain, I'm afraid, which is about how to build houses. The UK, a report was released today by the Resolution Foundation in Britain that showed that low to middle income people in Britain have 40% higher housing costs than is normal in the OECD, so than among other rich countries. Really, really high. The good news for poor people in Britain is that food and clothing are cheaper than in other countries, but if housing is 40% more expensive, that's a problem. So why does Britain find it so hard to build houses? That's not a problem only in Britain. You can see these challenges in the Netherlands, in Sweden, even in Canada, where you would think it would be very easy to build houses. There's lots of space. So we'll talk about that as part of what I call the prosperity trap. And so that's the outline for today. But I'm going to begin with a story. And the story is a story that I begin the section on democracy in the book with. This is one of the couple of personal stories in the book until my editors told me to stop talking about myself. But you get to hear me talk about myself now. And this was one of the few moments in my life where I have been able to be close to, but not at, the center of a big political moment happening. So this is Westminster. This is a beautiful House of Commons, a beautiful building that is a fire trap that nobody knows how to replace. So that's another problem, but I won't talk about that right now. I went to Westminster in March 2019, so almost 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago, sorry. We're moving through the years fast. And in March 2019, you know, in Germany, you didn't have to worry about this as much, but British politics was totally insane at this point in time. It was March 2019. We had Prime Minister Theresa May, you remember? Prime Minister Theresa May, 5 prime ministers ago, as we now are. It doesn't. It's, you know, we're sort of doing Italy in the 1950s, a prime minister every year in Britain, but with an electoral system that should make that impossible. But yet, now Theresa May is sort of the beginning of the end for prime ministers who get to last 5 years, because before May we had David Cameron for, how long was he in charge for? 6 years. Gordon Brown for 3.5, Tony Blair for 10 years, John Major for 5, Thatcher forever. And then suddenly we've had this mad carnival of prime ministers coming through. And this is the moment it starts happening, because this is when Theresa May tries for the very final time to pass a Brexit bill, to pass a bill where the House of Commons would decide how Britain would leave the European Union, would in fact choose to leave the European Union at all, because it required a bill to go through Parliament to activate Brexit. Now, this was March 2019, and you don't have to know much about history to remember that the Brexit vote was 3 years earlier in 2016, and there'd already been one general election between then, which was Theresa May's election in 2017, and Britain still hadn't come up with how it was going to leave the European Union, and in fact had made things worse by having an election where Theresa May lost her majority. It's not very common in British politics to not have a majority. So you will probably know our electoral system creates majorities. Right now, Keir Starmer is Labour Prime Minister. Exciting for the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung to have a centre-left leader in Britain again. And even more exciting, off a third of the vote, he has 2/3 of the seats in Parliament. So he has incredible power to do, well, not that much yet, right? So yeah, with great power sometimes comes great laziness or whatever. But Theresa May was in a really tricky situation for British Prime Minister, because she did not have a majority at this time. The Conservative Party were a few seats away from a majority, so they had to rely on the Democratic Unionist Party from Northern Ireland, Ian Paisley's old party, a very tricky party to deal with, to supply them votes to keep them in power. And that was very difficult for the Brexit bill that Theresa May wished to pass, because if she could not get them to vote for it, well, it wasn't going to happen. And even worse for Theresa May, and this will not surprise any of you, the Conservative Party didn't agree on what Brexit should happen. So the Conservative Party, very excited about having a vote to leave the European Union, less excited about coming up with an idea that they could all agree on afterwards. But May did have a plan, and the plan was a form of Brexit that would mean leaving the customs union, the trade agreement that Germany and all the members of the European Union are part of. It meant leaving the single market, so leaving the four freedoms of goods, services, capital, and most politically important people. And it meant coming up with some kind of deep and committed relationship with Europe that didn't involve those. It was going to be a hard Brexit, but not a super hard Brexit, because in order to keep Northern Ireland open to Ireland to cross the border, May actually basically needed to cut a deal where for a long time both Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom would remain part of Europe's customs union, at least until a better idea could come along. So that's the bill she came up with. We're going to leave the customs union officially. We're going to leave the single market. We're going to have a big fudge where we commit to a backstop for Northern Ireland, where we sort Northern Ireland out in the future. It'll do. It'll pass. It'll be great. It doesn't pass. It doesn't pass on a first go, so they do it again. It doesn't pass on a second go. At this point, the Speaker of the House, a guy called John Bercow, who is now essentially famous for appearing on American reality TV shows, he starts saying, well, look, you can't keep putting new bills up to Parliament. I'll give you one more go. So they have a third bill, and that fails. So now we're in trouble. Parliament can't decide what on earth to do about Brexit at all, and that's when I get to go to Parliament with my colleague Ian. That's the Ian up there. He's a guy called Ian McLean, who's a senior colleague of mine. Ian wrote a book called What's Wrong with the British Constitution, which is not quite as long as you might think it should be. But he knows everything about British politics. He also knows everything about election design. And we needed to know about elections and different electoral systems, because since members of Parliament could not decide in normal parliamentary procedure how to leave the European Union, or rather, whenever a bill came up, they voted it down, maybe there was some other magical way that we could get MPs to agree. So, essentially, Ian and I were asked by two MPs, a Labour MP and a Conservative MP, I guess I can give you their names, Stephen Kinnock, the son of Neil Kinnock, the Labour leader from the 1980s, and also son of Glynis Kinnock, who was the European Commissioner. He was on Labour, and then Oliver Letwin, who had been a sort of grandee in the Conservative Party. So they asked us to come into a room to try and come up with some rules that might help MPs make a decision. They couldn't make a decision on an up-down vote. They kept saying no. So, okay, what do you want? There are lots of ways of leaving the European Union. Right? Britain ultimately, under Boris Johnson, decided for a very hard Brexit, which we are slowly trying to retreat from in an embarrassing fashion. We could have had a Norway-style Brexit, where we had left the customs union but been part of the single market. We could have had a Turkey-style Brexit, where we'd stayed part of the customs union but left the single market, if I've got those right around. We could have tried, although I suspect people would have just shouted at us, to have a Switzerland-style Brexit, where we try and get everything we want and then get in arguments with the European Union every 3 years. We could have had, as we almost did, a Russia-style Brexit, where we're, sort of in Europe, but that's about it. Lots of different ways of Brexiting, and we thought, well, okay, maybe the problem is people don't want Theresa May's deal. Fine, we get that. But there are lots of other things they could have, and there are ways of organizing people's views about different options. So we could ask people to rank order their views about different types of Brexit. Do you want to have Brexit in name only, where you're still part of the single market and the customs union, or do you want to leave the single market, or do you want to leave the customs union? Do you want Theresa May's deal? Do you just want to set fire to everything and run around screaming, hurrah, hurrah, we've left the European Union? Lots of options. But please rank them for us, and then we can use voting systems to aggregate those. So here's one option. This, by the way, I was on the committee that elected the new Chancellor of the University of Oxford, who's William Hague, who's a Conservative politician. We use this system here to elect the Chancellor. Lots of different options. Please rank order them. And then what we will do is we will take our 6 options, say, and we'll first remove the option that the fewest number of people has as their first place, and we'll reallocate their votes, and then we'll remove the next one that is least popular until we end up with 2 final options. So we take things that are least popular out and we reallocate the votes. Or we could do a different version of this, a different flavor of ice cream here. This is the alternative vote, but instead of taking out the option that is least popular, you remove the options first that are most unpopular. So you take out first the things that the most people rank last, that people really hate. You take the things that people hate out until you're left, obviously, with things people could agree on. Now, notice a couple of things about this. The first system takes out options that nobody loves, and the second takes out options that everybody hates, and those are 2 different things, right? If you take out options that nobody loves, you get rid of things like Theresa May's bill that are sort of compromise agreements, and you end up with extreme positions. If you do the second one, you take out the extreme position that people hate most first. So these are different options, and they have different implications for how voting will work. Another option, and this is the one that was ultimately adopted, was to have no ranking at all. You just say, listen, here are 6 boxes, 1 for each of these options. Tick the ones that you could live with. You don't have to rank order them. I just want to know, imagine it's your family. Joachim spoke about all the examples in my book about game theory within your family. Okay, so here are 6 options for dinner, kids. Pasta, squid. No one's going to tick squid. Shepherd's pie, kebab, fish and chips, hamburgers. Please tick the boxes which you could live with, right? And then we'll choose among them if we get there. That's another option that doesn't have any of this ranking at all. So Ian and I sat down with these MPs and we gave them all these different options. And the problem that we had, the MPs came up with very quickly, which was, okay, these electoral systems make sense. We can't make decisions, though, about which outcome we want. And these different types of rules get rid of different outcomes in different orders. Remember, alternative vote gets rid of the things that everybody hates first, whereas the other alternative vote gets rid of, alternative vote gets rid of things that nobody loves. The other alternative vote gets rid of things that everybody hates. Sometimes you'll have an electoral system that gives you a compromise, more likely. Others will advantage extremes. So our MPs, they will look at these different rules and they will say, well, wait, can we choose among the rules? Because the different rules give us different outcomes. So now we have a new problem. Our initial problem was MPs can't agree on an outcome they want. But now MPs can't agree on a way of choosing outcomes because the different ways of choosing outcomes lead to particular outcomes, right? So MPs are clever. They're like, wait, I want this voting rule because, this is a very clever voting rule that perfectly aggregates results and conveniently gives me what I want. So this was our concern. So we've got a problem there. But even worse, MPs, you know what they do? They lie. They lie all the time, as we discovered, because they might lie about, even within any electoral system, what they actually want. So it's one thing to look at these 2 options I gave you and said, okay, we'll either get rid of the things that are loved by the fewest people or hated by the most people, but the MPs can change how they order things to try and trick the system. Okay? You might say, actually, I could live with this outcome, but I have a preferred outcome that I think is more likely to happen if I lie now and get rid of this compromise outcome, right? I can kind of shuffle it to the side. And unfortunately, that's exactly what the MPs did. Okay, so I know this is very hard to read. There's no test on this at the end, don't worry. But this comes from the Institute for Government. And here are the 8 different outcomes that MPs got to vote over. Now, they didn't end up doing any ranking because our MPs that we spoke to said, wait, everyone's going to disagree about ranking. So they opted for, I'll just jump back, this option. Okay, let's just tick anything that we could live with. So you'd think, how could you manipulate that? MPs are clever, or stupid, depending on how we think about this. Clever individually, but stupid collectively. We asked MPs to tick boxes, to say, okay, what can you live with? On the left, we have a new referendum. Then we have being in the customs union. Then Labour's alternative plan, which was basically like, are you a Labour MP? Then we have Common Market 2.0, which is stay in the single market and customs union. Revoke Brexit entirely. Exciting stuff. It's a punchy one. No deal, which means, throw your hands in the air, give the finger to Europe, run around screaming we've won, and then, panic when this has happened. That's what lots of the Conservative Party wanted. Standstill transition, which means basically don't make a decision at all, which you would think would be exactly the kind of thing Parliament would love. And then finally join EFTA and the EEA. Okay, so in all of these cases, the squares above are people voting yes, and the squares below are people voting no, and then down the bottom we have people choosing not to vote, abstaining. And you will see that in no case does yes outnumber no. So the MPs could not agree on any option at all. Okay, so that wasn't good. But what was particularly revealing was that MPs would pretend that they didn't like options that they probably did like. So if you look at our first 2 columns here, you'll see a bunch of yellow and orange at the top. That's the Scottish National Party and the Liberal Democratic Party. They wanted a new referendum, but if you go over to the next box, they all abstained about being in the customs union. Now, they probably would have preferred being in the customs union to what happened, which is Boris Johnson's Brexit. But they all pretended that they didn't really like it. Had their votes gone the other direction, had they not abstained, there would have been a vote for a customs union, and Britain would have remained in the customs union, which, I put it to you, they probably would have preferred to the outcome we got. But they tried to be clever. Even in a really simple system like this, they changed what they did. They did what they thought was individually rational, but produced a really collectively suboptimal outcome for Britain, which is no one chose anything. We had this horrible moment where we gave Parliament all of these new powers it never previously had to make a decision on its own, and they decided on nothing. Okay. So, total chaos. I use this example in the book to give a sense that people are really clever, and that's a problem. People are clever. They try and think how they're going to manipulate systems for their own end, not because people are evil, or malign, but because they're self-interested, as most of us are. It's hard to get politicians to not try and strategize through elections. I know I'm in the British Academy, which Joachim mentioned nicely earlier. One thing we do in the British Academy, basically the only thing we do, is elect new members of the British Academy. And every time I can see exactly the same things happening, which is people misrepresenting their votes so they can make sure that someone they really don't want to be a fellow of the British Academy is turfed out, right? So there's lots of this kind of individual strategizing. And I put it to you that that's a general problem with political life. It's extremely hard to not act in self-interested ways. It's often, in fact, harms us to not act in self-interested ways if everybody else is doing that. But summing up all of our individual behaviors leads us to collective bads, right? So everybody in those Brexit votes was acting rationally, or they thought they were acting rationally, but the collective outcome was irrational. And I want to argue again, it's not immoral behavior. So this is the slight challenge of the German subtitle of our book about overcoming egoismus. Well, can you do it? I decided not to ask for the subtitle to be changed. But it's not clear to me that asking people not to be self-interested is a good thing. And who else's interest are we going to act in most of the time? The challenge for politics is how to harness and channel our self-interest in collectively useful ways. And that's really difficult. That's a really important thing for left-wing parties in particular to be thinking about, because they tend to have a more collective view of societal goods than right-wing parties, and so the challenge is even larger. But one thing you shouldn't do is just complain that everybody's evil and selfish, because maybe we all are when we stare in the mirror. Collective action problems, which is what social scientists call this in an awkward way, they are pervasive. And so the collective action problem is essentially individual self-interest somehow undermines collective goals. The way to think about how we behave in this, and we saw this with the members of Parliament, is even if we all agree it would be nice in Parliament's case to make a decision at all, but other times to, have a national health service that could pay for all of our healthcare, or to have enough state capacity through taxes, say, to fund the country. We all have an incentive at the margin, if we can't be observed or if we can't be punished, to misbehave in some way. Right, so with taxes, people misrepresent how much they earned, or in certain European countries just don't pay them at all, or cheat in some way, or we slack off. And these are just pretty common human behaviors, and we can castigate them and we can call them immoral, but I think we do have to accept that they exist and try and design institutions to prevent them. And these are particularly difficult in politics. Right? So politics is where collective action problems are hardest. So this happens in economic life, it happens in legal life, but in the worlds of economics and law, there are contracts. There are contracts that can be enforced. So contract design in economics is a challenge, but it's enforceable. Right? So you often design a contract to avoid people cheating, to avoid people misrepresenting, and then if they do, you try and enforce it in the law courts. Most political decisions can't be enforced in law courts. Right? So if Friedrich Merz, to give an example of a potential leader of a country, made a promise before the next German election that everybody in Germany should get free internet broadband. That's a promise, by the way, that Jeremy Corbyn made in Britain in 2019. If he makes that promise, and people go and vote for Merz, and they say, I can't wait for my free national German broadband. And then Merz gets into office and he says, actually, no, I'm not going to give you the broadband. After all, I've decided that we don't have enough money. You can't sue Friedrich Merz. You can't say, wait, a promise was made and I demand my broadband. Now, you could sue the local telecom company if you paid them for broadband and they did not deliver. That would be an economic contract. A political promise is just a promise. It's not enforceable by law. Now, maybe it should be, but it's hard to see how that would happen. Another good example is something we should all be thinking a little bit about, which is what happens if Russia decides to invade Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia. And the United States, under President Trump, decides not to abide by Article 5 of NATO and to come and defend the Baltic countries. Okay, so can Lithuania, and Latvia, and Estonia sue the United States? Can they take them to court? Well, not really. There's no NATO court that can force the United States to abide by the treaty that it's signed or abide by an alliance. They either decide to or they don't. Now, we have created a thing called NATO with lots of rules and laws, but ultimately nobody can make the United States defend these countries. That's why it's a challenge, and that's why we worry about it. So to me, the core problem in political life is this kind of problem. You cannot enforce political contracts. Hey, another good example is what happened in Germany with the FDP and the SDP. You can't force somebody to stay inside your coalition. You can't say, wait. Well, we agreed on a coalition. I'm going to take you to the coalition court and sue you. Too bad. And I think that's what distinguishes politics and makes politics really hard. It makes politics more challenging in many ways than other social sciences, because there's no judge, jury, or executioner to force us to do things. And so all of the things I'm going to talk to you about today, basically, they're in that shadow of uncertainty. So what is politics then in that word? So the way I think of politics is it's about making promises to each other to do things collectively that override our self-interest. right? We acknowledge that we are self-interested. If we want to have collective goals, we're going to have to restrain ourselves in some way. That's why we make a promise. Otherwise, we wouldn't need to make a promise. But those promises are very contingent. They're very frail. They're ephemeral. They are like spiders' webs. They look like they're attaching things together, but you can snap them very, very easily. We always disagree on things, and we're always going to try to get what's best for us individually, even if we don't recognize that. So we're going to have to find a way to take those promises that live in a world where we disagree with each other and we have incentives to break our promises, and find a way to embed them in the absence of having a court who we can rely on, like you could for an economic contract, to enforce it. We have to do the enforcing ourselves, okay? And so the way I think in the book about what that enforcement or what that embedding looks like is this is what political institutions do. They are promises that we fossilize. They're past promises that we made a long time ago in a series of rules, and maybe nice buildings with names like the European Court of Justice or whatever, that we create as a series of rules to follow with one another. But ultimately, countries don't always abide by them, right? You can leave the European Court of Justice, as Britain has learnt. To its benefit, not clear, but it can be done, right? So those institutions cannot fully bind you, but you make it hard to stop following them. Or the other thing we could do, and this is more just in the way that we behave with each other day to day, is we can try and create social norms of behavior that aren't written down, but are nonetheless patterns of behavior that we punish each other for not abiding by. Right, so this is things like not using racial slurs, not spitting at people on the street. I recognize there are laws about this, but not always. Not just being rude to everybody you meet, which there is no law about, but there are clearly social norms about. Okay? Now, those patterns of behavior and beliefs they're even flimsier than institutions, but they also matter in politics. There's an example I give in the book of the city of Bogota in Colombia. And it had this interesting mayor called Antonis Mockus. And Mockus had all of these norm-enforcing ways of getting people to behave in Bogota, which is a place, it's in Colombia, it's in a country where there's not a lot of social trust, even in the kind of richest part in Bogota. There's a couple of things he does. One is that when Bogota is running out of water, Mockus asks people to take short showers and avoid having baths. But the way he does this is by having TV commercials where he strips down to his underwear and has a shower demonstrating the amount of time it takes to have the shower for 30 seconds or a minute. And then they would show the amount of water that had been used in Bogota on showers each day to try and encourage people to get into this. And there's an even more extreme version of this, which is that Bogota has very bad traffic, had a lot of road rage with people getting angry with each other in cars. And so what Mockus did was he employed mimes, French mimes like Marcel Marceau, so people dressed in a mime outfit who did this in the street and then would pretend to die if a car went too fast. Now, the mime does nothing other than look crazy, a person acting in the middle of the street to control traffic. But it did create a norm of behavior, which is, don't do something stupid in your car where the mime pretends to die. Right? So it's not like having a police officer, you're not enforcing it, you're just trying to create norms of behavior. So I hope we get to see mimes on the street of Bonn after this presentation, pretending to die if people accelerate too fast. Okay. One final thing before I get onto these 5 sections of the book. There are 2 ways of reading the title in the book. One is to say, why is politics so bad? Why does it fail? And we've just gone over that for ages and ages already. Self-interest undermines collective outcomes. But there's a more sophisticated answer to why politics fails, which readers of the book will hopefully learn, which is that we're stuck with politics. So things are even worse if we pretend that politics doesn't matter and we can ignore it. Okay, so here are a whole bunch of books on the right of this that I think are wrong, because these are books that basically want to replace politics with something else. They either want to replace it with a populist leader who's going to stop all these elites fighting with one another and rule on behalf of the masses. I think we've seen quite a lot of that in recent years. Or they say, you know, the problem is it's just that politicians are bad people, they're immoral people. And if only we had nice people in charge, this is kind of Rutger Bregman view of the world, well, then it would be fine. And I just fundamentally disagree with both of those views. I think we will always disagree on things, that's fine. And we shouldn't sit there and wait for some kind of leader who's magically going to speak on behalf of all of us, whether they're from the left or the right. That person doesn't exist. But we also can't replace politics with markets or technology. Right? And you can see a lot of this in the kind of Silicon Valley view of the world, which is, well, this politics thing is terrible. Surely there's a way we can use AI to get rid of politics and make decisions for us. And for reasons I go into in the book, this isn't going to work because AI systems suffer the same logic of voting problem we saw with Westminster. Right? There are certain times where there are no set ways of aggregating all of our decisions that make everybody happy. So all that happens is you'll have the chaos of disagreement, but just occurring at light speed through fiber optic cables. The political problems are fundamental. They can't just be removed through technology or markets. Okay, so I think I've just said what I said there, but I'll go to the last part. The way I think about politics is like a toothpaste tube. Right? When you squeeze your toothpaste tube, actually, do you know what my children do? They're teenagers now, so it's even worse. Instead of squeezing a toothpaste tube, they turn it like a screw. So I have these toothpaste tubes that are kind of wrapped around like that, which is a very inefficient way of getting toothpaste out. But there we are, that's teenagers for you. When you squeeze your part of your Crest or your Colgate, try and push it down in one area, of course it pops up in another. Okay, and that's my view of the way that politics works. If we try and remove politics from one part of the system, it just appears elsewhere. You know, think back to the example I gave you of the members of parliament. If we try, because MPs can't vote up or down on a bill, to say, okay, we'll resolve that by having you rank different outcomes, then the politicians just go, okay, what's best for me about ranking the outcomes? And the politics just shifts along. Okay? Or Boris Johnson can get Brexit done. Oh, we got Brexit done, right? That happened. We had an ending to that point. But Brexit hasn't gone away, and the political disagreements about Brexit have not gone away. They were not solved. They were just displaced into a new zone where we now have arguments about youth mobility schemes and fishing rights. Okay, so let me spend about 5 or 10 minutes now on the 5 traps, and then I'm going to come to a little bit of data for you. Okay, so what are these traps? So each of them has an exciting motto that Penguin asked me to write for each of them. Right? So the one for democracy, which we've seen with Parliament already, is that there's no such thing as the will of the people. So if you're a fan of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, you can leave the room now. This dates all the way back to Rousseau. I mean, much as I love Rousseau, and indeed Rousseau is the origin of the story I'm going to tell you next, I don't think it's useful to think of there being a volonté générale, a general will that is out there. I think disagreement is far more pervasive than that. I'm more of a believer in Kenneth Arrow and this idea that under certain conditions it's actually impossible to have a kind of social agreement on a set of preferences if people disagree in too fundamental a way. And it's not very useful because it tends to get manipulated by politicians who will take a 51% victory or 52% victory in the British case, and they will call it the national will, and they will ride over everybody else to get what they want afterwards. Right? Unless we all agree, then it's pretty pointless to talk about a pure will of the people. But, and here is the example that Rousseau wrote about, we could try, like what happens if you do try and have a full will of the people? So this is an interesting example from my book. This is the Polish-Lithuanian parliament of the 17th and 18th centuries, called the Sejm. Pardon my pronunciation of it. So Poland-Lithuania, you will know, of course, does not exist as a commonwealth today. And the reason it doesn't exist is because of the partition of Poland at the end of the 18th century by Prussia and Russia and, to some degree, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Poland-Lithuania no longer exists. Why does it no longer exist? One of the reasons, and there are probably quite a few, including its geographical location not being ideal, surrounded by those empires, is that it had an intriguing institution in its parliament called the liberum veto, which I understand, well, I'm not a classicist, is Latin for I freely oppose. And what the liberum veto allowed you to do, if you were one of these parliamentarians, is if you didn't like how a parliamentary debate was going, you could raise your hand, exercise your liberum veto, and bring the debate to an end, which is quite a kind of nuclear option for 17th century Polish legislation. Okay, so any of these people could stop a debate. Now, political nerds among you will know that this is somewhat similar to the filibuster in the US Senate. But the filibuster required you in the past to stand and talk all night, right? So there was actually a cost to it. You couldn't just go, liberum veto, done, and then leave. You did have to do something. And then the filibuster eventually has become more of an institution and more of an agreement, basically, between the parties about how many votes you need. So this is like a mega filibuster. And you can imagine that this is not a fully optimal system because it's very hard to get things done if everybody has to agree. And by the end of the 18th century, some of these parliamentarians were being paid by the Prussians and the Russians to exercise the liberum veto, which made it enormously difficult for Poland to defend itself from Prussia and Russia, right? So this was a very exploitable flaw. This is a bug in the system. And I mean, this is a particularly extreme example of what happens if you give everybody a veto, but it's pretty easy to see how asking for a true will of the people is going to be very easily manipulable, and even in that case. Okay. The second part of the book, and there are 3 chapters in each of these parts, is on equality. And I'm going to speak more about this in a second, so I'll go through it very, very quickly. But the argument I make here, this is, I suppose, the more kind of small L liberal part of the book, is that equal rights or equal freedoms and equal outcomes end up undermining each other. Right? In extremis, the easiest way to think about this is that it is extraordinarily hard for everybody to earn exactly the same amount of money without compelling people in some way. Right? You can compel people through Stalinist collectivization. That's clearly not a kind of equal rights view of the world. There are ways to have that kind of equality. The political theorist Jerry Cohen had this idea of the egalitarian ethos. If we could convince everybody, no matter their effort or productivity, to truly believe in egalitarianism, yes, then we can let people do whatever they want, have equal rights, and have equal outcomes. But I put it to you, that's pretty hard to achieve. So there's going to be some trade-offs at the margin. Of course, if we give everybody equal economic freedoms, we've got no hope of equal outcomes. So a lot of politics, for social democrats, for liberal democrats, is really about trade-offs along this frontier. Okay? Now, the bad news is you can also have unequal rights and unequal outcomes. Right? So that's what much of the world looks like. But to get both at the same time is very difficult. Talk about, for example, some of the challenges Sweden had with the famous wage earner funds, where they gave workers the right to vote on boards and gave workers ownership of companies. And that actually led to protests in Sweden, hundreds of thousands of people in Stockholm protesting socialism. Amazing. There's an example I give in the book about debates about wealth taxation that happened in 2019 between the various economists associated with various members of the Democratic Party. On the left is Emmanuel Saïs, the French economist, talking about the very high levels of wealth inequality in the world. That's what this graph is here that he has up, and the need for a wealth tax on wealth above $30 million. I'll come back to this in a bit. And on the right we have Larry Summers, famous bête noire of the economics profession, who was Clinton's Treasury Secretary and was in the kind of Biden team. And he roasts Saïs to bits to say there's absolutely no way that wealth taxation in America can ever work, not least because if rich people have the equal right to spend their money however they want, they will spend it before you can tax it. And we'll come back to this in a bit. Solidarity. So this is basically, for social scientists, this is a chapter about the welfare state. This is the Esping-Andersen chapter. And here the challenge is basically how do we come up with systems of social insurance that we can all agree on? How can we come up with solidaristic ways of looking after each other when we really only want insurance when we need it, right? We've all been in that situation where our bike has been stolen and we wish we bought contents insurance, or we have smashed our car up and wished that we hadn't got the cheap insurance, or we lost our bag and wished we had travel insurance. And the same thing applies for social insurance. And the example I begin with in that chapter is with Obamacare and how hard that was to get in America. Now, there's lots of reasons, including race relations in America, why Obamacare was so difficult to get through. But one was this idea of the mandate. The mandate was this idea in the Affordable Care Act, in Obamacare, that everybody who didn't have health insurance should pay a fine in their taxes, right? So in other words, you needed to buy health insurance and not piggyback on other people and hope to kind of, get emergency treatment. This proved to be really, really controversial because young, healthy people did not want to pay for insurance that they thought they didn't need. And in fact, the US Supreme Court ruled that part of Obamacare unconstitutional, so it no longer exists now. Right? So you can see this, even with the kind of thing we're very used to having in Europe, right? Social insurance through healthcare, it's still a politicized issue in places that don't fully have it. The fourth chapter of the book, or section of the book, is about security. And here I talk about this trade-off between anarchy, where there's no control over what any of us do, and tyranny, when there's too much control. Right? This is the kind of who guards the guardians problem. And the main focus in that chapter is on the experience that we all had, everybody in this room, which was COVID, where Western states had to figure out how to lock citizens in their houses for, at least at the beginning, for 23 hours a day or whatever. In the UK, we were allowed out for an hour a day at the beginning. We had all these situations of the police driving around arresting people for going on a walk with a friend drinking coffee by a lake. I mean, that's quite tyrannical. Right? If I were to walk out of here with a coffee and be arrested by the German police, I'd be disappointed. I'd find this to be tyrannical behavior. But during COVID, we all got very used to that. Okay? And here, these are some photos from China. These are the yellow barricades that were placed outside apartments in Wuhan in China, where COVID originated. People were sealed into some of these apartments using soldering irons. That's very strong stuff, but that's extraordinarily tyrannical. But when the Chinese finally let people physically out, in order to manage the anarchy, they had to move to a new system. They moved from barricades to barcodes, and people had little barcodes on their phone that they had to show the police. Are you green, which means you're fine? Are you amber, which means you've been near somebody with COVID recently? Or are you red, which means you probably should not have left your house and God knows what happens to you, right? So that was a big challenge for all of us. And those places that opted for anarchy, like South Dakota, which had the Sturgis motorcycle rally with 1 million people during COVID, ended up with very high death rates, right? This was a trade-off that had to be made. And then finally, there's prosperity. And prosperity, the idea of prosperity is that whenever we're thinking about how we're going to get richer, how we're going to have more in the future, we have to trade off taking costs today to be wealthier tomorrow. That's what an investment is, right? And if I go and study, like some of you here at the University of Bonn, you're taking the huge cost of having to sit at these desks all the time and listen to people like me, hopefully to make more money in the future. Right? That's what an investment is all about. Collectively, that's quite challenging to do, as we've discovered with climate change, which requires us to cut emissions now to have in the future, and possibly not our future, but our children or grandchildren's future, a world that is not much warmer. And so that's a kind of prosperity challenge from hell. But the example I want to give you here is one in the UK, which is a rather more mundane one. This is Euston Station. This is the Google Earth view of Euston Station in North London, which is the main station to Manchester. So I used to take the train up here when I went to Manchester University. And you'll see to the left of the station a kind of patch of sand that looks like a motocross track. And that, my friends, is the High Speed 2 terminal to the north, which has been abandoned. So High Speed 2 was Britain's attempt to build a high-speed rail network from London to Manchester and to Leeds to go with High Speed 1, which is the train to Paris. So High Speed 2 was abandoned by Rishi Sunak basically to try and lower some taxes because it was becoming increasingly costly And the benefits would be, well, after Rishi Sunak had lost the election. And so instead now of having a high-speed train going from London to Manchester and to Leeds, we have a high-speed track to Birmingham. Okay, that's half of the way, but it won't even get to Euston. It will get to a place that none of you have probably heard of called Old Oak Common, which is about 10 miles west of Euston, somewhere in West London, between Wormwood Scrubs Prison and Car Giant, the largest second-hand car dealer in the country. So that is where you will have to go to get to Birmingham. Right? This feels like a kind of skeleton in the scaffold for making long-term decisions. This is a bad outcome that you don't want. Now, I've taken too much time, so I'm just going to go through the first of my data examples. I've got to give you one example. And I want to give the one that seems most germane at the moment because it has this delightful man. I'm obviously speaking about the person on the left. You may or may not like Bernie Sanders, but I feel like the world is converging on views of Elon Musk right now. So Elon and Bernie here. You might not be able to read the tweets, so let me read these out to you. So Bernie Sanders, this is back in 2019, saying, "We must demand that the extremely wealthy pay their fair share, period." It's a very American way of finishing a sentence, period. You could just put a period in, but they say it. Elon's response to that is, "I keep forgetting that you're still alive." Classy. Followed by, but this is more germane to what we're talking about, "Want me to sell more stock, Bernie? Just say the word." So what Musk is saying there, in his delightful way, is you can try and tax my wealth, but because I am free, I have equal rights to dispose of my wealth as I wish to, I'm free to turn that wealth into consumption right now. And then you can't tax it through a wealth tax, right? I can just buy a whole bunch of bottles of champagne. Or I could spend the money on tickets to see the Yankees. Obviously, it's going to take a lot of those for Elon Musk's money. Or, and this is exactly the kind of thing Musk would do, I could buy Twitter. Or I could put lots of campaign contributions into an anti-wealth tax political action committee. And these were the types of things that Larry Summers from earlier was warning about. Okay? Wealth tax is hard because if we're going to give people equal rights to use their money, we might try and tax that money to equalize it and discover it's already moved away. So this is one of the reasons it's so hard to tax wealth, but it should, you would think, be easy. Because the types of wealth tax that Bernie Sanders was talking about, the ones that Emmanuel Saez had come up with, who we saw earlier, would only apply to wealth above $30 million. Now, 75,000 American households, so that's quite a lot of people, have more than $30 million in wealth. Okay, so that's quite a lot of people. On the other hand, you know what really is a lot of people? The 159 million voting Americans who don't have $30 million. So it feels like David versus Goliath here. Goliath should be the American electorate. David should be these wealthy households, but David is winning. Okay? American wealth inequality is very, very high, and it's not taxed. So the Gini, that's the inequality indicator between 0 and 1, of American wealth is 0.9. Getting that close to 1 is really hard on the Gini index, but don't worry, the Americans have managed it. And it's much, much higher than inequality of incomes in America, which is 0.5, which is still quite high by international standards, but it's not a crazy number. Okay? Just to give you an example here, the UK, it's lower, but still with financial wealth quite high. And so why is it that 75,000 people are able to beat 159 million? Well, it's not obvious, and that's one of the things that I talk about in this chapter. But I'm going to tell you now, using some data from my project, and then we'll finish off, why that might be the case. Just to give you a sense of what's going on with wealth taxes. This is the top rate of inheritance tax for 18 countries. This is data that my colleagues and I collected. And so you'll see here that most of these lines, except for Germany, just hovering around the middle, are going down. So the Australians and the Austrians and the Canadians and the Norwegians and the Swedes have all got rid of inheritance tax entirely. Okay? In most other countries, like say the UK or Finland, it's lower than it used to be. In America, you can see this at the bottom, United States, this jolt down and up. That's because George Bush, when he did his tax cuts in the early 2000s, had them expire in 2007. But for 1 year, before they expired, inheritance tax, or the estate tax as it's called, went to 0, and then it went back to where it was before. This is how they made the numbers add up. Right? So if you were wealthy and your parents died in that year, you were going to pay nothing in inheritance tax. And there is an episode of Law and Order where that is precisely the plot of that American crime show, which is people killing their parents in order to take advantage of this spike the moment before. So there we are. That makes taxes interesting. But okay, look, it's going down everywhere, even though wealth is really high. That just seems odd from a political perspective. So what I did is I asked a whole bunch of people in the UK, what do you think about taxing wealth? And we had them move a slider between 0 and 10, where 0 is, I'd like a tax system that taxed people's wealth. We tell them what wealth is. 10, tax people's income from work. And I think I expected, most people will move this to 0, right? Because most people don't have that much wealth. But that is not really what happened. In fact, slightly more people prefer income taxes to wealth taxes. Okay? Now, it could be that people are confused and they're wrong, although we did some experiments that doesn't seem to be the case. Or it could just be that people have very strong views about how unfair wealth taxes are. So we asked people in this survey as well, do you find these types of taxes to be fair? And this is the proportion who find a tax to be fair or very fair. What do Brits think is fair? Income tax, national insurance, which is basically, it's a kind of social tax, a workers' tax on your income. So they're kind of the same thing. What do they think is very unfair? Inheritance tax, stamp duty, which, if you guys don't know, is the tax you pay when you transfer a property, and tax on interest rates, or tax on earned interest. Right, those are all taxes on wealth, or on capital. Those are the taxes that people find least fair, and yet very few people, only about 3% of estates have inheritance tax in the UK. Not that many people make much money from interest rate payments at all. And stamp duty only applies if you're buying a house worth more than about £400,000. So again, that's actually not that many people. Everybody pays income tax and national insurance. So, I mean, this ought to concern, I think, social democrats who want to tax wealth. And this is one of the things I do. I go around telling social democratic parties, be careful about this, because people don't like it. We thought, okay, well, are there ways of getting at this? Like, what's really going on? So what we did is we asked people to give us a sentence to explain why they chose the answer they did. And we thought, people just won't bother. And a couple of people didn't bother, and I'll come to them in a second. But most people wrote these incredibly long sentences, so I was like, please stop writing. This is taking too much time in the survey. And what kinds of things do they say? So on the right here, I have a slightly techie graph, I'm afraid, but what we did was we took all the words that people had, and then we conduct statistical tests to see what types of words are most associated with different groups. So what are the types of words that renters use? And what are the types of words that homeowners use? So renters, when they think about wealth, they use words like hoard, like Smorg, the dragon. They use words like inequality. They also use brilliantly IDK, I don't know, which means this person has not bothered answering the rest of the question, but fair enough. And what do homeowners say? They say words like save, saving, penalize, encourage. Right? They don't like wealth taxes, as you might imagine, and they're using all these arguments about individual fairness. I have already worked hard. I have saved my money. You are penalizing my saving. You should be encouraging saving. Renters, by contrast, they're using these everyone, everything, inequality words. Society-wide, it's not fair that people have so much wealth. We should have equal outcomes. So you can see our equal rights, equal outcomes thing here. And so we thought, okay, can we change people's views if we run this survey again and we change the way that we word our question, and we do it about inheritance tax, and we put in front of our question for some people, not the control group, who just get a boring question about inheritance taxes, but for others, we say things like, some people call inheritance tax death taxation or double taxation. For others who answer this question, they are put into the experimental treatment of being told, inheritance tax can create a level playing field and equalize opportunity across society. Right? That's a kind of social fairness. And then we thought we'd drive our own Brexit bus through this, and so we said to another group of people, raising inheritance taxes could help the government lower other taxes or increase spending on public goods like the National Health Service. Right? So that's our Brexit bus. So what works? Okay, another horrible graph, but bear with me. On the right here, we have shifting, and sorry, overall level, you might pay, your heirs might pay, and these are just different inheritance tax questions. On the right here is thinking the taxes are too high. On the left is thinking the taxes are too low. And our red, yellow, and blue are the difference when we prompted people in different directions. So in other words, the red barrier here, if it's to the right, it means that death taxes, if you mentioned death taxes, it made people think inheritance tax was too high. It shifted them away. And it shifted them away by about 10 percent points. So basically, you could shift people towards thinking inheritance taxes were too high by 10 percent points, it's quite a lot, just by mentioning double taxation. Or blue, if you mentioned taxes and the NHS, i.e. we could use the revenues on goodies like the NHS, you could shift people to the left, which meant taxes are too low, inheritance taxes are too low, you should raise them. That's good. What's bad news is that the yellow one, which is talking about fairness, had no effect at all. Nobody cared. Now, it's not that people don't care about social fairness, it's just that the people who care about social fairness can't be shifted by telling them about it, and the people who don't care about it don't care. It's not effective political rhetoric. Right, so this, I think, is an important thing to understand about how people make their minds up about the wealth tax, which is ultimately, sadly, people are kind of self-interested. If you talk to them about how it's unfair because individually it taxes you twice, people hate the inheritance tax. If you say, I'll tell you what, I'll give you something, like the NHS or an income tax cut, people are like, oh, that's great. But if you go for just assuming that people can be motivated by being a good person, by being socially responsible, it doesn't have the same effect. And that's sad, but it's also what comes out of this data and why I think taking self-interest seriously is important. All right, I'm just going to run through to the end and say thank you very much for joining me, and this is the book. And I know we're now going over to the conversation, so sorry for overrunning.